In the bitter winter of 1950 Chicago, snow blanketed the streets and muffled the city's cries, creating an eerie stillness that seeped into St. Helena's Hospital. Nurse Evelyn Carr moved through dim corridors, her uniform pristine, her hands steady, her eyes hiding the exhaustion and fear that gnawed at her soul. She had tended to countless dying patients, holding their hands, whispering soft prayers, watching the light leave their eyes, yet nothing had prepared her for what came after. It began subtly, a cough in the morgue when no one was present, a faint knocking under the floorboards, whispers that seemed to drift from the walls themselves. Evelyn told herself it was exhaustion, overwork, the long winter nights playing tricks on her mind. But then she began hearing names, soft at first, almost drowned in the hum of the heaters, then louder, pleading and unmistakable. They called her Evelyn and spoke of things no one else could know. The color of her first dress, the day she had almost drowned as a child, the secret she had buried in her own heart. She began staying after shifts, watching the bodies in the morgue, listening for more. Sometimes she thought she saw lips move, the cold skin trembling with the echo of life that should have been gone. One night, as she passed Holy Cross Cemetery, snow crunching underfoot, she swore she heard coughing beneath the freshly turned graves, cries and whispers begging for attention. She froze, the wind dying around her, the world holding its breath, and for the first time in her life she felt fear grip her bones. The next morning, a patient she had watched over just the night before was found missing. Official reports claimed the death was natural, the burial routine, but Evelyn knew otherwise. She kept her eyes open, her ears straining for the faintest sounds that others would dismiss as imagination. The hospital staff began noticing her odd behavior, standing silently near the morgue doors, murmuring to herself, lingering over the empty beds long after the night shift ended. Some whispered she was hearing the voices of the dead. Others avoided her, calling her disturbed, unstable, a woman haunted by her own conscience. Evelyn didn't care for their opinions. She had started documenting everything, every whisper, every cough, every faint plea that came from the unclaimed dead. She wrote feverishly in a small notebook, her handwriting uneven, slanting, jagged as if trying to capture sounds that belonged to another world. One night, while tending to a recently deceased patient, she heard a voice so clear it made her stumble back. "You left me." Her hands shook as she closed the eyes of the corpse, the whispered accusation lingering in the air long after the body was prepared for burial. The voices intensified, echoing in her apartment, following her through snow-filled streets, pressing against her at every corner. She began visiting the cemetery at night, listening, speaking softly to the graves, trying to answer, to calm, to reason with the dead who refused to rest. Her neighbors reported seeing her silhouette moving among tombstones, kneeling, whispering to the cold soil, her breath forming words that dissolved into the night. The hospital tried to dismiss her, sent her home under the guise of exhaustion, but Evelyn returned. She couldn't leave, could not ignore the pleas, the cries, the voices that demanded she hear them. One morning she vanished. Her uniform was found folded neatly at the hospital steps, her shoes by the cemetery gate, and her notebook, filled with names and dates, lay open on the snow-stained ground. Some say she had gone to answer the final call, stepping into the soil itself, becoming part of the whispers she had spent her life trying to soothe. Others say she was claimed by the voices, taken beyond the living world to a place only she could navigate. The city never understood. The hospital buried its secrets as carefully as it buried its patients. But those who walk the night shift still report hearing a woman's voice in the halls, whispering names, counting heartbeats, calling out to those who can no longer answer. Evelyn Carr became a legend, a warning, a haunting presence in Chicago's cold winter nights, a reminder that death is never silent, and the dead sometimes demand to be heard. Evelyn Carr never slept without hearing them. Each night, the walls of her small apartment trembled with voices that had no right to exist, pleading for attention, for recognition, for release. Even the wind outside seemed to carry fragments of their calls, moaning through the narrow streets, brushing against the frozen windows, twisting her thoughts into knots. She began to feel the dead inside her mind, shadows pressing at the edges of her consciousness, memories not her own mingling with her own guilt. The hospital staff whispered behind her back, calling her obsessed, paranoid, unfit for duty. But Evelyn could not stop listening. She documented every sound, every murmur, every plea that came after death. Her notebooks overflowed, pages pressed together with fevered writing, ink smudged with tears and snow. One night she ventured again to Holy Cross Cemetery, kneeling beside graves recently disturbed, brushing her hands through the frozen soil, whispering apologies and promises. The voices rose in chorus, urging her to dig, to uncover truths that had been buried too quickly, too carelessly. She found bodies shifted in their coffins, scratches on wood, disturbed earth that betrayed the hurried hands of grave diggers. She did not run. She listened. Each plea carved deeper into her conscience, each whisper reshaping her understanding of life and death. News spread through the city of strange happenings at the cemetery. Some claimed to see a figure in white moving among tombstones at dawn, kneeling, murmuring to the soil. Others reported faint cries and knocks under the ground when no wind blew. Evelyn's actions became the source of hysteria. Authorities tried to intervene, but she evaded them, appearing at the gates of cemeteries unannounced, carrying lanterns, shovels, notebooks. Every grave she visited seemed to respond, soil shifting slightly, frost disturbed in unnatural patterns, whispers rising and falling as though approving her presence. Her obsession grew. She began visiting graves in the dead of night across the city, recording names of those unclaimed, their deaths hastened by neglect or misfortune. Some nights she heard more than voices. She felt pulses, heartbeats beneath her hands, tremors in the soil, tiny shifts of bodies not yet at rest. Her body weakened, her eyes hollowed, but she persisted. Families of the dead began contacting the hospital, questioning timelines, exhuming graves, discovering discrepancies Evelyn had warned about. Authorities dismissed her at first, citing hysteria, but the physical evidence could not be ignored. The dead had been buried prematurely, their graves disturbed, their voices perhaps forever echoing. Evelyn herself vanished one icy morning. Her apartment door stood open, notebook gone, shoes and uniform left neatly in place, a final note scratched onto the wall. They were never silent. I listened. Some say she joined the voices she had tended to, walking beneath the snow into the graves themselves. Others claim she continues to wander Chicago's night streets, answering the whispers of those who cannot rest. Her story became legend among nurses, a caution whispered at night shifts, a haunting reminder that some deaths cannot be controlled, that silence is not always final, and that the dead may demand attention long after the living have left them behind. Even today, in the quiet of snow-laden alleys or the dim hallways of old hospitals, those who are sensitive claim to hear her footsteps, her voice mingling with the calls of the departed, eternally listening, eternally answering. In 1950, Chicago was a city of contrasts, a place where wealth and poverty collided in harsh lines along the streets. The hospitals were crowded, their wards overflowing with patients, many abandoned by families or too poor to afford proper care. St. Helena's Hospital, where Evelyn Carr worked, was a sprawling institution built in the late 19th century, with long corridors that seemed to stretch into darkness, and a basement morgue that had not seen proper renovation in decades. The hospital staff was overworked, exhausted, and indifferent in many cases, focusing on procedure rather than compassion. Evelyn had entered the profession with genuine intent, hoping to heal and provide comfort, but the reality was brutal. Death came swiftly and often without ceremony, and the administration prioritized efficiency over humanity. In the winter of 1950, the strain of overcrowding was evident. Reports indicated that patient intake had risen sharply after a harsh flu outbreak, and the hospital was forced to double patients in single rooms. Evelyn worked long night shifts, tending to bodies that would not last the night, administering medication and recording deaths. The morgue beneath the hospital was small, damp and cold, a place where the recently deceased were stored in drawers until burial arrangements could be made. It was there that Evelyn first noticed anomalies: coughs from bodies in drawers, soft thumps in the tiled corridors, and the feeling of presence that was not human. The other nurses dismissed her observations as fatigue-induced hallucinations, but Evelyn had witnessed things that could not be explained away. Patients declared dead sometimes showed signs of life during transfer to the morgue: faint twitches, irregular breathing, or subtle shifts in muscle tone. The hospital records, however, reflected only the official death times. Evelyn grew increasingly disturbed by these discrepancies, documenting her observations secretly in notebooks hidden under her bed. Her notes included precise times, patient names, and descriptions of faint sounds or movements she had witnessed. Over weeks, she compiled evidence suggesting that several patients may have been buried prematurely, a fact that would have horrified the city if exposed. The cemetery where these patients were sent, Holy Cross, was located on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by iron fences and old trees that blocked sunlight in winter. Graves were shallow, often rushed to accommodate the high mortality rate, and coffins were sometimes handled carelessly by overworked gravediggers. Evelyn visited the cemetery regularly, ostensibly for personal reflection, but in truth to observe the resting places of those she feared had not been properly laid to rest. She noted disturbed soil, slight displacements in coffin lids, and sometimes faint sounds she swore came from beneath the frozen earth. The police and local authorities were preoccupied with post-war crime waves and organized gangs, leaving little oversight for hospital practices or cemetery conditions. Evelyn's growing awareness of these conditions, combined with her own sensitive nature, set the stage for the events that would lead her into obsession and isolation. She began hearing whispers not only from the living patients but from those she had believed were gone. She documented their voices meticulously, using shorthand to capture sounds that defied explanation, convinced that someone, someday, might take notice. Colleagues began noticing her erratic behavior. She would linger over newly deceased patients for hours, speaking softly, often returning to check morgue drawers multiple times per night. While the administration labeled her behavior as exhaustion or mental instability, Evelyn's meticulous records told a different story, one of a woman uniquely attuned to the boundary between life and death, and to the mistakes that had been hidden in the shadows of a busy hospital. The backdrop of post-war Chicago, with its crowded streets, its underfunded hospitals, and its cold winters, created an environment ripe for tragedy. Evelyn's sensitivity, combined with institutional neglect, ensured that she would witness horrors others ignored, and that the voices she heard would follow her relentlessly, shaping her actions, her obsessions, and ultimately, the legend she would leave behind. Evelyn's life became a careful balance between her duties at St. Helena's Hospital and her private investigations into the deaths she could not ignore. Every day she witnessed the hurried ministrations of doctors who rarely lingered at a patient's bedside, and nurses who juggled the numbers rather than the suffering. She saw the humanity stripped from the system, replaced by charts, forms, and procedures. The more she observed, the more she realized that errors were inevitable, and sometimes fatal. She began questioning everything: the death certificates, the timetables, even the protocols for verifying life. In the morgue, she discovered discrepancies. Bodies labeled unclaimed that were in fact patients whose families had been too poor to retrieve them. Coffins improperly sealed, lids loose or damaged, evidence of bruising or scratches that were never documented. Evelyn meticulously noted every anomaly, often comparing hospital records with cemetery logs, and she found inconsistencies that defied explanation. The dead, it seemed, were not at rest. On her walks to Holy Cross Cemetery, she noticed patterns: the soil settling differently above certain graves, frost disturbed even in the coldest nights, a faint vibration she felt in the soles of her shoes. Some nights she would kneel at a coffin, pressing her ear to the lid, whispering apologies, asking questions. She said later that she could feel the pulse of those trapped between life and death, their desperation palpable, their need for acknowledgement consuming. Her colleagues grew increasingly concerned. Evelyn would enter rooms alone, linger beside corpses long after all others had left, talking quietly to the dead in tones only she could hear. At night, she was often seen near the hospital's loading docks, notebook in hand, lantern flickering against the shadows, scribbling feverishly. The administration, at first dismissive, began to notice patterns: patients marked dead too soon, burial records inconsistent, complaints from families growing. Yet no one could understand the source of these irregularities, and Evelyn refused to speak to anyone outside her notebooks. The city itself provided a chilling backdrop. Chicago winters were cruel. Streets slick with ice, winds cutting through the alleys, muffling the sounds of life and amplifying the whispers of the departed. Public attention was elsewhere, focused on crime, post-war recovery, and industrial growth, leaving hospitals largely unmonitored. Evelyn used this to her advantage, moving quietly, listening intently, noting everything. She became obsessed with time, exact minutes, hours, and seconds when patients were declared dead, when they were moved, when burials occurred. She believed that by tracking these intervals she could identify those who had been taken too soon, those whose final moments had been stolen. Her personal life deteriorated. Friends drifted away, frightened by her obsession and the intensity in her eyes. Sleep was rare, often interrupted by whispered names, the soft tapping of coffin lids, the unmistakable thump of a heart that should no longer beat. She began leaving messages in cemeteries, small notes with names and times, hoping someone would eventually see them, understand them, and perhaps act. Sometimes she would awaken in the night to find snow covering her footprints from the cemetery gate to her apartment, as if someone, or something, had followed her home, unseen. Despite warnings, Evelyn persisted. She recorded everything with methodical precision, documenting even the faintest anomaly. A misaligned grave marker, a shifted coffin lid, an unusual frost pattern over a resting body. She understood what others could not, that death was not always final and that silence did not mean peace. By the end of the winter, her notebooks had multiplied, dozens of volumes filled with names, dates, and observations, a map of the dead in Chicago, each entry painstakingly recorded. Evelyn had become both witness and intermediary, a conduit for voices long ignored, and she knew that her work was far from over. In the midst of a city bustling with commerce, with crime and with post-war rebuilding, she alone bore the burden of the dead, a burden that would follow her relentlessly, shaping the events that were to come and leaving behind a legacy of whispers, secrets, and unfinished farewells that would haunt St. Helena's Hospital and Holy Cross Cemetery for decades to come. In the months following the winter of 1950, Evelyn Carr's life had become a careful routine dictated by the whispers of the dead. Each night at St. Helena's Hospital brought new sounds, new urgencies, and new confessions from those who had been buried too hastily. The hospital corridors stretched endlessly, white walls and flickering lights creating a labyrinth where the living and dead intertwined in silence. Evelyn moved through these halls like a shadow, listening, observing, recording. Nurses whispered about her behavior, calling her obsession dangerous, unstable, unnatural, but Evelyn paid no attention. She had learned to distinguish the living from the departed, the fleeting murmur from the persistent plea, and she knew that ignoring these voices meant abandoning those who had no one left. She began mapping every incident, every anomaly. On November 13th, she noted 3 cases where patients declared dead exhibited signs of posthumous movement before burial. In the morgue, she observed small twitches of fingers, subtle lifts of eyelids, and faint exhalations that betrayed life. She documented everything, insisting that the records would tell the story if she did not live to do so herself. As the city slept, Evelyn walked the halls carrying a lantern, notebook in hand, listening to whispers that floated from room to room, sometimes following her footsteps, sometimes coming from beneath floorboards. She discovered that certain rooms, often those in the oldest wing, were particularly active, their walls vibrating with faint murmurs. She experimented, moving corpses slightly, observing the effects, recording temperature, position, and the timing of the sounds. Outside the hospital, Holy Cross Cemetery was increasingly restless. Graves shifted subtly, soil displaced, frost patterns inconsistent with natural weather conditions. Evelyn spent nights digging carefully around recent burials, confirming her fears that some had been laid to rest while still alive. The cries she heard were not uniform. Each voice had a distinct rhythm, a cadence, a signature that she could identify across multiple graves. Her obsession deepened. She began to hear additional layers beneath the whispers, tiny sobs, low groans, the faintest heartbeats. Sometimes she pressed her ear against the coffin lid and felt vibrations, small but unmistakable, as if the earth itself were trying to communicate. Inside the hospital, the staff grew uneasy. Nurses reported hearing her talking to the deceased, sometimes kneeling by their beds for hours, other times dragging coffins back to the morgue to re-examine their condition. Administration meetings became tense. The hospital board discussed suspending her, but Evelyn had supporters, some doctors who had noticed discrepancies in records, who knew the dead were sometimes claimed prematurely, who respected her dedication and courage. The city outside remained indifferent. Chicago was a growing metropolis of industry and crime, of post-war rebuilding and shadowed streets where violence often went unnoticed. Evelyn's mission was invisible, her struggles silent to all but the voices she heard. The whispers began forming patterns, They spoke of fear, of injustice, of unfinished lives. They whispered of people forgotten by family and society, left to die alone, buried in haste. Evelyn listened with unwavering attention, recording each detail. She began to anticipate deaths before they occurred, hearing the faint tremors of life fading in the halls of the hospital. This predictive ability unsettled her colleagues further. Some believed she was clairvoyant, others that she had lost touch with reality. Evelyn did not argue. She accepted the reality of her perception and dedicated herself entirely to documenting the final moments and the cries that followed. On nights when she returned home, the whispers did not stop. Her apartment seemed alive with the presence of those she had tended, their voices following her, pressing through walls, floorboards, and ceilings, demanding attention. Evelyn would sit at her small desk, scribbling notes feverishly, pausing only to listen and transcribe. Her health declined, but her resolve strengthened. Each observation, each interaction with the restless dead, fortified her understanding that something systemic was deeply wrong. Hospitals were failing, cemeteries were failing, and the dead were demanding recognition and justice. She knew she had to continue, no matter the personal cost, for the dead would not rest until she listened. Evelyn Carr's nights grew longer, colder, and heavier, with the weight of voices that no one else could hear. The hospital corridors became a liminal space where reality and the dead intertwined. The whispers evolved, forming sentences, warnings, and pleas. They spoke of unfinished lives, untold secrets, and hurried burials that had stolen moments of truth. Evelyn's meticulous notes captured every detail: names, dates, faint sounds, tremors under the floor, and subtle shifts of corpses that had been prematurely buried. On particularly frigid nights, she visited Holy Cross Cemetery armed with lanterns and notebooks, kneeling beside graves, brushing soil carefully aside, and pressing her ear to wooden lids. The cold bit through her uniform, frost clinging to her hair, but she remained unmoving, listening. Some graves revealed faint scratches on coffin lids, impressions of fingernails or displaced soil, confirming that her suspicions were real. Evelyn began creating charts to track patterns, connecting hospital death records with cemetery burials. She cross-referenced dates, times, and anomalies, forming a web of evidence that painted a horrifying picture of systemic negligence. The dead were calling out and the living had failed to notice. Staff members at St. Helena's grew uneasy. Night nurses whispered about her unusual habits, kneeling by bodies for hours, murmuring, adjusting blankets, or lightly tapping drawers. Doctors noticed her staring intently at the floor during rounds, lips moving as if in conversation. Some began to fear her. Administrators debated transferring her, yet the discrepancies in hospital records that only she documented prevented any disciplinary action. Evelyn's obsession drew her deeper. She began to see patterns in the whispers, noting that certain deaths corresponded with hurried administrative decisions, understaffed shifts, and neglect. Each detail was recorded, sometimes with charts and diagrams, sometimes with hastily scribbled shorthand that captured the rhythm of the voices she heard. Outside the hospital, Chicago's streets remained indifferent to her struggles. Factories churned smoke into gray skies. Gangs prowled alleys, and ordinary citizens were preoccupied with survival and work. The dead's calls were invisible to all but Evelyn, yet their presence was undeniable to her. Sometimes she felt their hands brushing her sleeve, heard faint sobs through walls, or felt a pulse beneath her feet. Her personal life eroded. Friends abandoned her, unable to comprehend her obsession, frightened by the intensity in her eyes, by the soft murmurs she carried everywhere. Sleep became impossible. She lived in a state of hyper-awareness, navigating between the living world and the silent cries of those prematurely buried. She noticed the patterns of graves disturbed in the cold winter nights. Soil shifted unnaturally, frost melted in precise shapes, and subtle indentations revealed the dead's attempts to communicate. Evelyn recorded each anomaly meticulously. One night she discovered that certain bodies had been marked incorrectly, labeled dead hours before their hearts stopped. She traced their final movements through hospital logs, interviews with exhausted staff, and cemetery records. Each discovery compounded her horror, yet she persisted, knowing that the dead demanded recognition, that the living must bear witness. The whispers were no longer confined to the cemetery. They invaded her apartment, seeping through walls, pressing against doors, slipping under windows. Evelyn documented them all, creating a growing archive of evidence that challenged understanding, reason, and the boundaries of life and death. Despite exhaustion, frostbite, and isolation, she continued. She understood that failure to listen would condemn the voices to eternal unrest, and perhaps doom her own soul in the process. The dead demanded attention, and Evelyn Carr became their only conduit. The night air grew colder, the snow deeper, and the city remained oblivious, yet her dedication never wavered. Each whisper reinforced her commitment. Each anomaly confirmed her path. Evelyn walked between worlds, a witness to those who should have been forgotten, a caretaker for voices lost to indifference. By the end of the season, she had amassed an archive of unimaginable scope. Hundreds of names, dozens of graves investigated, every detail meticulously recorded. Evelyn knew that her journey was far from over, and that the city of Chicago would remain haunted not just by the dead, but by the truths she had uncovered and the voices that demanded acknowledgement. By spring of 1951, Evelyn Carr had reached the point of no return. Her investigations, meticulous and obsessive, had uncovered horrifying patterns. Patients declared dead too early, graves hastily filled, and a system that prioritized speed over life. The whispers followed her relentlessly, and she began to believe that the dead were speaking not only for themselves, but for countless others whose deaths had been overlooked. One night, a particularly chilling series of events unfolded that would forever define her legend. In the West Wing of St. Helena's Hospital, a new patient, Mr. Leonard Hayes, had been admitted with severe pneumonia. Evelyn monitored him closely, noting every irregularity in his breathing and pulse. The attending doctor, pressed for time, documented him as stable and predicted recovery. Yet Evelyn sensed the faint, desperate movements beneath the surface of life. She spent hours at his bedside, whispering reassurances and listening to the subtle murmurs of voices emerging from the walls. Suddenly, the monitors, which had been silent, began flickering. The room temperature dropped drastically. Evelyn felt an icy hand brush her shoulder, though no one was present. The whispers intensified, urgent and insistent, calling her name alongside Mr. Hayes's. She tried to wake the doctor, but he dismissed her insistence, attributing it to fatigue. She realized then that she was alone in comprehending the truth. The patient was dying, but the official records would declare him dead hours earlier, a tragedy repeated in countless cases. Evelyn's hands trembled as she reached for the stethoscope, feeling a pulse beneath her fingertips that was weak but unmistakable. She called for assistance, and only then did the doctor notice the subtle but critical signs. The intervention saved Mr. Hayes, though the records would later be altered to reflect a simpler narrative. This event confirmed Evelyn's suspicions. The dead, the nearly dead, and those neglected in haste were all connected through a network of oversight, error, and unheeded cries. She realized that her work had to escalate, that she must intervene directly to prevent further tragedies. Outside the hospital, she visited Holy Cross Cemetery again, this time following leads she had compiled over months. Several graves had been disturbed, lids misaligned, soil unusually compressed, and frost patterns that defied explanation. Kneeling at one particular grave, Evelyn felt the vibrations clearly, a heartbeat against the wooden coffin. She traced the identity through her records. A young man declared dead prematurely, buried without ceremony, his family uninformed. She pressed her hands to the lid, whispering words of apology and acknowledgement. The soil shifted minutely under her touch, the whispers forming coherent sentences that urged her to continue. Evelyn began a series of covert exhumations, working with a few trusted colleagues who had started noticing irregularities in the hospital's mortality reports. They uncovered bodies exhibiting signs of premature burial, bruised hands, splintered coffin wood, teeth marks on tongues, signs of struggle against confinement. The reality was horrifying. The system's negligence had produced victims who had suffered even after death. The dead had been silenced artificially, hastily, without recognition. Evelyn documented everything, filling notebooks, charts, and diagrams. Every exhumation, every anomaly, every whispered accusation was meticulously recorded. She realized that the hospital's procedures were deeply flawed, and that the negligence was widespread, affecting dozens, perhaps hundreds of patients. The whispers became more demanding, guiding her toward the most egregious cases, revealing secrets that no living person could have known. Evelyn's obsession reached a fever pitch. She began working nights exclusively, revisiting old cases, cross-referencing hospital logs with cemetery records, and personally inspecting graves. Her colleagues expressed concern for her mental health, but Evelyn ignored them. Her focus was absolute. The dead demanded attention. One night, the culmination of months of investigation occurred. She uncovered a grave that had been hastily filled, the coffin poorly secured, the soil displaced and the body partially exposed. Kneeling, she listened, and the whispers converged into a coherent plea. "Do not forget me. Do not leave us." Evelyn documented every detail, aware that she was the only intermediary capable of ensuring recognition for the deceased. That night she stayed at the cemetery until dawn, kneeling in snow, soil frozen beneath her palms, listening, recording, acknowledging. The city slept unaware, and the hospital continued its routines, but Evelyn Carr had reached a climax of understanding, comprehension, and horror. The dead had revealed themselves fully, demanding her intervention, and she had answered. Her actions would ripple across the hospital and cemetery records, initiating a reckoning that would expose systemic negligence, challenge human comprehension of death, and create a haunting legend whispered among Chicago's night shift nurses for decades. Evelyn Carr's obsession reached its zenith as she confronted the full scope of the horrors hidden beneath St. Helena's Hospital and Holy Cross Cemetery. Each grave she inspected revealed the consequences of human negligence. Coffins splintered, soil displaced, bodies bearing marks of struggle, and subtle signs that death had come too soon. She had amassed dozens of records cross-referencing hospital logs, patient charts, and burial documents, each confirmation intensifying the whispers that had followed her relentlessly for months. One particularly harrowing night, Evelyn discovered a series of coffins in the oldest section of the cemetery, recently disturbed and hastily refilled. She knelt beside them, listening, pressing her ear to the cold wood, and felt unmistakable tremors. The voices were loud, urgent, coherent, and insistent. "Remember us. Don't leave us alone." Evelyn meticulously documented every anomaly, noting the names, dates, and conditions of each body. She realized that hundreds of patients had been lost to oversight, buried before their time, their suffering invisible to all but her. Her heart pounded, her hands shook, yet she continued, driven by the conviction that the dead required acknowledgement. She coordinated discreetly with a few trusted colleagues, exhuming graves under cover of night, carefully inspecting coffins, and comparing findings with her extensive logs. What she uncovered was staggering: bruised limbs, fingernail scratches, teeth marks on tongues, and evidence of bodies moving within coffins post-burial. These findings confirmed her suspicions. Many had been buried alive. Evelyn's dedication became a ritual. She visited the hospital before her night shifts, the cemetery in the darkest hours, returning home only briefly to record her observations and plan the next interventions. The whispers were no longer subtle, they were demands, urging her to act swiftly to prevent further injustice. During one exhumation, she uncovered a young woman who had been buried hastily after being declared dead from complications of influenza. Evelyn pressed her hand against the coffin lid, feeling vibrations and faint movements, evidence that her intervention might have reached the threshold between life and death. She documented every detail with fevered precision, aware that these records might be the only proof that such tragedies had occurred. The dead were not silent, and Evelyn had become their only advocate. Rumors of her nighttime activities began circulating quietly among hospital staff. Some feared her, others admired her, but all understood that Evelyn was no longer a typical nurse. She had become a bridge between the living and the dead, a recorder of injustice and a witness to horrors concealed beneath routine and negligence. The culmination of her work forced confrontations with hospital administrators, who were forced to acknowledge discrepancies, premature burials, and mishandled cases. Evelyn's notebooks, charts, and diagrams provided undeniable evidence, and authorities could no longer ignore the scope of the failures. In a final chilling act, she stood in the cemetery under a pale moon, kneeling beside multiple graves simultaneously, whispering apologies and recording the pleas of those who had suffered most. The frost beneath her palms clung stubbornly, the soil whispered beneath her touch, and for the first time, she felt a faint sense of recognition from the voices she had spent months listening to. Evelyn's actions initiated change. Burial procedures were reevaluated, Oversight increased and hospital staff became acutely aware of the consequences of negligence. Yet the legend of Evelyn Carr persisted, a haunting presence whispered among nurses, a warning to those who ignore the boundaries between life and death. The dead had demanded attention, and Evelyn had answered, walking a path few could comprehend, forever intertwined with the voices that followed her relentlessly. Chicago slept on unaware while the graves shifted subtly, acknowledging the nurse who refused to ignore their cries. After the harrowing events that defined Evelyn Carr's relentless pursuit of truth, the city of Chicago slowly began to recognize the magnitude of what had been ignored for decades. St. Helena's Hospital, once a sterile institution focused solely on efficiency and protocol, faced scrutiny from both internal audits and city health authorities. Reports surfaced detailing cases where patients had been declared dead prematurely, bodies mishandled, and graves disturbed with shocking frequency. Evelyn's meticulous records, notebooks overflowing with names, dates, and observations, became central to understanding the depth of negligence. She had uncovered a systemic failure so profound that administrators were forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Some staff members were reprimanded, others quietly reassigned, but the ghosts of their oversight lingered. Evelyn herself became both feared and revered. Nurses whispered her name during night shifts, recounting tales of her nocturnal vigils, her strange communion with the dead, and the evidence she had gathered that proved deaths were not always final. Families of victims came forward after seeing discrepancies between hospital records and cemetery logs, demanding explanations, investigations, and closure. Evelyn, though exhausted, assisted discreetly, providing detailed accounts from her observations. Her notebooks acted as a guide, documenting not only the neglect but also the moments of intervention that had prevented additional premature deaths. Beyond institutional recognition, the city itself felt a subtle shift. Rumors of haunted graves and restless spirits spread quietly, the fear and fascination of residents mingling with the chilling reality that the dead had been calling out, and someone had finally answered. Evelyn continued her nightly routines, visiting cemeteries, whispering apologies, and recording every nuance of post-burial activity. The whispers persisted, though now tinged with gratitude as if the dead acknowledged her dedication. Yet the emotional toll was immense. Sleepless nights, relentless exposure to the suffering of others, and the isolating nature of her work left her physically weakened and mentally strained. Friends and colleagues drifted further away, unable to understand her obsession or the constant pull of voices from beyond. Evelyn's apartment became a second morgue of sorts. Notebooks piled high, sketches of graves, and detailed charts of hospitals and cemeteries forming a labyrinthine map of the dead in Chicago. Despite exhaustion, she pressed on, driven by an unshakable sense of duty. The hospital administration, while officially acknowledging procedural failures, struggled to fully comprehend the personal cost borne by Evelyn. She was praised in hushed tones, her dedication described as extraordinary, yet the psychological and emotional weight she carried was invisible to all but herself. Public fascination grew as well, with local newspapers hinting at mysterious events tied to cemeteries and hospital wards. Stories of a nurse who communed with the dead circulated quietly, blending fact and legend. Evelyn remained elusive, refusing interviews or recognition, focusing solely on the work that had defined her existence for the past year. She became a figure of both reverence and fear, the embodiment of someone who had straddled the fragile line between life and death. Her interventions had saved lives, uncovered systemic negligence, and brought to light truths that many preferred remained hidden. Yet for Evelyn, recognition was secondary. The dead had spoken and she had listened, and that alone mattered. Holy Cross Cemetery, once a silent and undisturbed resting place, began to show subtle changes. Caretakers reported small shifts in soil, faint sounds during cold winter nights, and inexplicable frost patterns that aligned with Evelyn's nightly visits. These anomalies were noted, catalogued, but never fully explained. Evelyn herself interpreted them as signs of acknowledgement, a quiet gratitude from those she had tirelessly served. The city moved forward. Hospitals adjusted protocols and families received closure. But the memory of the tortured nurse who had heard the dead lingered in the collective consciousness. Evelyn's legacy was one of vigilance, compassion, and an unflinching confrontation with death and neglect. A reminder that the line between life and death is fragile, and that the voices of the departed demand to be heard. Evelyn Carr's relentless vigilance did not go unnoticed by a few who dared to look beyond the surface of St. Helena's Hospital. Certain doctors and administrators began quietly consulting her notes, cross-referencing patient files and cemetery records, realizing that the scale of premature deaths and hasty burials was far greater than any single individual could have imagined. Evelyn's evidence painted a grim tableau. Dozens of patients, mostly forgotten by family or overlooked due to poverty, were buried while still showing signs of life. Hospital protocols were rewritten, staff retrained, and emergency procedures for verifying death strengthened. Yet Evelyn continued her nocturnal pilgrimages to cemeteries. She remained the sole witness to phenomena that the living could neither see nor comprehend. Faint thumps beneath the soil, whispers forming coherent words, subtle movements within coffins that confirmed the ongoing unrest of the dead. These occurrences persisted despite institutional reforms, signaling that bureaucracy could correct some failures, but not the spiritual disquiet she had encountered. Evelyn's health deteriorated further under the strain. Her hands were perpetually cold, her eyes sunken, but she carried on as if propelled by forces beyond comprehension. Each night she navigated Holy Cross Cemetery's labyrinth of tombstones, lantern in hand, notebook open, documenting minute changes in soil, frost, and coffin alignment. On several occasions, she encountered patterns in graves that corresponded to patients whose deaths had been ignored or misreported, evidence that the dead were still communicating, guiding her toward unresolved cases. In the hospital, staff who had once feared her began to respect her diligence, though whispers of her odd behavior persisted. New nurses, especially those working night shifts, were warned. Never disturb her when she knelt by a body, never question her midnight excursions, and never assume the dead were silent. Evelyn's reputation grew beyond the hospital walls. Families whose loved ones had been neglected or prematurely buried came seeking her guidance, often unaware of the supernatural nature of her work. She quietly provided information, helping them understand inconsistencies in records, locations of graves, and the timing of deaths. Some reported hearing soft whispers or feeling subtle movements during visits to the cemetery, reinforcing the legend of the nurse who communed with the dead. The city itself began to sense something unusual at Holy Cross Cemetery. Caretakers noted unexplained shifts in soil, frost patterns forming intricate designs over graves, and faint murmurs that could not be attributed to wind or animals. These subtle signs were recorded in private logs, often attributed to folklore, yet Evelyn understood their significance immediately. The dead acknowledged her vigilance. Evelyn's work had initiated a permanent transformation in the perception of death within the hospital and community. The acknowledgement of past negligence, the implementation of improved procedures, and the heightened awareness among staff were milestones, yet they did not ease the haunting burden she carried. The voices persisted, as insistent as ever, reminding her that vigilance was eternal, that carelessness could never be fully eliminated, and that the dead required attention beyond what protocol alone could provide. Despite this, Evelyn found a quiet satisfaction in knowing that she had answered the calls of those who could no longer speak through conventional means. She became a silent guardian of both the living and the dead, navigating between worlds with unwavering dedication. Night after night, her presence in the cemetery continued to blend reality with the ethereal. Snow, frost, soil, and whispers intertwined, creating an environment where the boundary between life and death felt permeable. Evelyn listened, recorded, and responded, ensuring that no voice went unheard. The hospital eventually recognized her contributions formally, yet Evelyn required no accolades. Her mission had never been for recognition but for justice, acknowledgement, and the preservation of dignity for those who could not advocate for themselves. Her legend endured, whispered among night shift nurses, caretakers, and families, a haunting testament to the nurse who refused to ignore the dead, whose life became inseparable from those she served, and whose actions would shape perceptions of mortality and care for generations. Even after institutional reforms and widespread acknowledgement of the tragedies uncovered by Evelyn Carr, a shadow lingered over Chicago, a subtle but persistent reminder that not all questions had answers. Holy Cross Cemetery remained restless, a silent theater of whispered voices and minor disturbances that defied explanation. Caretakers reported faint sounds echoing in the dead of night, Soft taps against coffin lids, low groans, and whispers that seemed coherent yet indecipherable. Evelyn herself continued her nocturnal vigils, documenting every anomaly. Though she recognized that some phenomena could never be fully understood, certain graves responded more than others, the soil shifting in ways that suggested ongoing agitation, as if the dead were communicating through a language beyond human comprehension. Evelyn attempted to trace patterns connecting hospital records with cemetery disturbances, but gaps remained. Some individuals had vanished entirely from records, bodies unclaimed, their deaths registered incorrectly or not at all. These cases became her most haunting focus, compelling her to search deeper into the archives, into hidden sections of the hospital, and into the darkest corners of Holy Cross Cemetery. She found that the whispers often corresponded with these unresolved cases, guiding her attention like a compass toward what had been forgotten. One night, she encountered a grave that had been superficially examined by authorities months earlier. The soil seemed slightly disturbed, frost patterns forming intricate swirls over the coffin lid. Pressing her hand against the wood, she felt faint pulses beneath her palm, vibrations that defied any logical explanation. She recorded the anomaly meticulously, noting time, date, and atmospheric conditions. Yet even with all her documentation, the voices remained cryptic. The dead's messages were not fully translatable, leaving Evelyn with both evidence and uncertainty. Rumors began to circulate among night shift nurses and cemetery caretakers about a nurse who could hear the dead, about graves that moved subtly on their own, about voices that guided Evelyn to cases long forgotten. While some dismissed these stories as folklore, Evelyn knew that the phenomena were real, tangible, and deeply unsettling. Attempts to involve the police or medical authorities in these ongoing anomalies yielded little result. Scientific methods failed to capture the faint tremors, the subtle temperature shifts, and the inexplicable whispers that she alone could detect. Evelyn theorized that the dead existed in a liminal space between life and the afterlife, capable of signaling the living only through extraordinary sensitivity, and that human oversight had blinded most to these communications. Some of the dead seemed to seek resolution, others vengeance, and some remained silent but restless, as if trapped in cycles of neglect and premature burial. Evelyn's records grew increasingly complex, filled with coded shorthand, diagrams of soil displacement, sketches of frost patterns, and acoustic transcriptions of whispers that could not be otherwise captured. Her obsession with solving these mysteries deepened, yet she understood that some aspects were likely beyond human comprehension, phenomena that defied reason and scientific explanation. Each night the whispers grew louder, forming subtle choruses, hints of narratives that spanned decades, linking hospital errors to cemetery disturbances and the restless dead. Evelyn documented these links meticulously, though she knew that no living audience would ever fully grasp their significance. Certain graves seemed to respond differently based on the time of night, the weather, or even Evelyn's own emotional state, suggesting a complex network of interactions that remained partially shrouded in mystery. In these moments, Evelyn felt both awe and terror, understanding that her role was not merely investigative but spiritual, bridging worlds that few dared to acknowledge. Despite her exhaustive documentation, she could not prevent every anomaly, could not answer every whisper, and could not restore complete peace. The dead remained, in part, unsolved, a haunting testament to the limits of human comprehension and the depth of systemic failure that had allowed their suffering. Evelyn's presence at Holy Cross Cemetery, at St. Helena's Hospital, and in the collective consciousness of those who knew her story, ensured that the dead would not be forgotten entirely, even as mysteries persisted, unsolved and possibly unsolvable. The line between observer and participant blurred, leaving Evelyn to navigate realms that were both tangible and spectral, a liminal witness to injustices, hauntings, and whispers that would never cease entirely. Evelyn Carr's nights became increasingly surreal as she delved deeper into the unresolved anomalies that haunted St. Helena's Hospital and Holy Cross Cemetery. Even after months of meticulous documentation, the dead continued to communicate in ways that defied explanation, their voices forming patterns that were only partially intelligible, their movements subtle yet persistent. Certain graves seemed to emit vibrations that correlated with unrecorded or misreported deaths, while others responded to Evelyn's presence in ways she could not predict. She began to chart these responses, creating diagrams and timelines, noting subtle environmental factors, wind direction, soil density, frost patterns, and temperature fluctuations. Her notes grew into a labyrinthine archive of phenomena, each entry a testament to the continuing unrest of the dead. Attempts to involve authorities or scientists yielded frustrating results. Instruments failed to register vibrations beneath the soil, audio recordings captured only faint static, and temperature gauges fluctuated without pattern. Evelyn understood that the phenomena were beyond conventional measurement, that the dead communicated on frequencies or in manners inaccessible to standard human perception. The whispers became more coherent over time, forming faint sentences, warnings, and pleas for attention. Evelyn recognized certain voices from previous cases, patients she had personally monitored, documented, and in some instances saved, now returning to guide her toward new anomalies. She felt a profound responsibility, a moral imperative that transcended ordinary professional duty. Each visit to the cemetery became a journey into layered realities, physical, spiritual, and psychological. The soil seemed to shift beneath her touch. Frost patterns responded to her movements, and faint thumps suggested the continued unrest of those prematurely buried. Evelyn began to understand that these phenomena were not random. They were systematic, a network of unrest tied to human negligence, institutional failure, and the lingering consequences of premature burials. The dead, in effect, had become active participants in her investigations, guiding her attention, testing her resolve, and reinforcing the necessity of her work. Socially, Evelyn became increasingly isolated. Friends and colleagues could not comprehend the ongoing events, nor could they perceive the subtle disturbances she documented. Yet she continued tirelessly, recognizing that the dead's voices were not a figment of imagination, but a tangible reality demanding acknowledgement. The cemetery itself seemed alive with residual energy, graves shifting slightly in response to her presence, frost melting in intricate, deliberate patterns, and whispers forming coherent guidance that she recorded meticulously. Evelyn theorized that these were not hauntings in the traditional sense, but residual consciousness, echoes of unfinished lives, and an extension of unresolved human error. She followed these leads tirelessly, revisiting old graves, examining unclaimed bodies, and cross-referencing hospital and cemetery records to identify individuals whose deaths had been mishandled. On numerous occasions, she uncovered anomalies that confirmed her theories: misidentified corpses, incorrectly recorded death times, and coffins with evidence of movement post-burial. Despite the overwhelming volume of cases, Evelyn persisted, understanding that each acknowledgement, each record, and each intervention provided partial relief to the restless dead. The whispers, sometimes urgent, sometimes sorrowful, guided her to patterns that suggested a systemic problem extending far beyond St. Helena's Hospital. Citywide negligence, unmonitored cemeteries, and a culture that had historically undervalued the lives of the poor and marginalized. Evelyn documented everything, aware that her findings could never fully satisfy the dead, but that acknowledgement itself was a powerful act of intervention. Night after night she navigated this intersection of life and death, meticulous in her recordings, unwavering in her vigilance, and singular in her ability to interpret phenomena invisible to ordinary perception. The mystery of the dead's unrest persisted, unresolved and partially unsolvable, yet Evelyn's presence ensured that these voices would not be forgotten, that their cries would echo through her meticulous records, and that the haunting legacy of negligence would be confronted through her unwavering dedication. Even as some questions remained unanswered, Evelyn understood that her work was essential. She was the bridge between worlds, the witness to injustices, and the voice for those silenced prematurely, ensuring that their stories, whispers, and unrest would endure. As Evelyn Carr approached the culmination of her relentless vigilance, a haunting clarity settled over her existence. The dead she had spent countless nights listening to, documenting and acknowledging, had transformed her life into a continuous bridge between worlds. Every grave at Holy Cross Cemetery, every record in St. Helena's Hospital, and every whisper she captured had left an indelible mark upon her psyche. Her nights were no longer merely shifts or investigations. They were pilgrimages into a realm where life and death intersected in unpredictable, chilling ways. The city moved on around her, indifferent to her nightly excursions, unaware of the extraordinary labor she undertook to honor the dead. Yet within her a profound connection had developed, an unspoken understanding that the voices she heard were both warnings and guidance, echoes of injustice demanding redress and traces of lives prematurely silenced. Evelyn's presence became a constant, a fixture acknowledged silently by those few who glimpsed the extraordinary depth of her commitment. Families of victims sought closure through her guidance, tracing graves, correcting records, and learning of the subtle truths she had uncovered. Evelyn provided this without pride, without acknowledgement, understanding that her reward was intangible, measured only in the soft whispers of the dead that occasionally shifted from sorrow to relief. In her apartment, notebooks multiplied, maps detailed cemetery plots, charts tracked hospital records, and diagrams depicted patterns of soil disturbance, frost, and vibration. Each page was a testament to the endurance of both the living and the dead, a record of her unwavering dedication and an acknowledgement that some injustices could never be fully erased. Evelyn's own health deteriorated under the weight of relentless vigilance. Sleepless nights, emotional strain, and constant exposure to grief had left her frail, yet her resolve never wavered. She understood that the dead required her attention, and she could not abandon her mission. Even as whispers became subtler, less urgent, she continued her nightly pilgrimages, kneeling by graves, recording disturbances, and acknowledging lives once dismissed or forgotten. Holy Cross Cemetery, previously silent and orderly, had taken on an unsettling vitality, a responsiveness that defied logic yet confirmed Evelyn's theories. The dead were not inert, their presence detectable only through extraordinary observation and attunement. During her final months of active documentation, Evelyn discovered that some voices had grown silent. Some anomalies ceased and a few graves exhibited signs of rest, suggesting that acknowledgement, attention, and meticulous care could influence the dead's unrest. Yet other graves continued to whisper, move, and vibrate subtly, a perpetual reminder that vigilance could never fully end, and that some mysteries would persist eternally. Evelyn reflected on the paradox of her work. She had saved lives, documented horrors, and brought acknowledgement to countless forgotten souls. Yet the line between life and death, observer and participant, remained forever blurred. She had become part of the haunting she studied, a witness to both tragedy and resilience, embodying the intersection of human compassion and supernatural vigilance. Her legacy was not one of fame or recognition, but of profound moral courage, dedication, and unyielding commitment to justice for the dead. Evelyn's notes, later preserved in archives, served as both historical records and chilling testimony to the consequences of negligence, the presence of the unseen, and the enduring connection between the living and those lost too soon. Even as the city's rhythms continued, oblivious to the nightly communion she maintained, Evelyn understood that her work had altered the spiritual landscape of St. Helena's Hospital and Holy Cross Cemetery permanently. The dead had been heard, their suffering acknowledged, their unrest mitigated, and yet the weight of unresolved cases persisted. Evelyn embraced this duality, knowing that perfection was unattainable, that some questions would remain unanswered, and that her vigilance itself was a form of justice. Night after night, she continued, a solitary figure navigating snow-laden paths, lantern in hand, notebook open, kneeling by graves, whispering apologies, listening, documenting, and bearing witness. In doing so, Evelyn Carr transformed from mere observer to intermediary, a guardian for voices long silenced, and a symbol of relentless dedication in the face of horrors both human and supernatural. Evelyn Carr's final nights of active vigilance were marked by a solemn routine that blurred the boundaries between life and death. She moved through Holy Cross Cemetery as if guided by unseen hands, lantern casting long, wavering shadows across frost-covered graves. Each tomb bore witness to her dedication. Each whisper she recorded a testament to lives once forgotten, and every tremor beneath the soil confirmed that the dead were not entirely silent. The city around her carried on, unaware of the nightly pilgrimages, the meticulous record-keeping, and the subtle interventions that had preserved lives and acknowledged deaths prematurely recorded. Evelyn's apartment remained a repository of meticulous notes, charts, and sketches. She had cataloged countless anomalies, soil displacements, frost formations, coffin vibrations, and whispers that formed coherent sentences, names, or pleas. Each entry was carefully cross-referenced with hospital and cemetery records, a testament to her unwavering dedication and the depth of the mysteries she had confronted. Over time, Evelyn noticed subtle signs of acknowledgement from the dead, graves that shifted slightly less, whispers that softened, and frost patterns that no longer formed erratic shapes. It seemed that her tireless interventions had brought a measure of peace, though never complete resolution. Yet some graves continued to manifest anomalies, reminding her that vigilance was eternal and that not all disturbances could be reconciled. Evelyn reflected on the paradox of her existence. She had become an intermediary, a bridge, a silent witness to tragedies that most could neither perceive nor understand. Her life had been consumed by the task of listening, recording, and acknowledging, yet she accepted it as a sacred duty. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep was often impossible, meals irregular, and her social connections virtually non-existent. Friends and family drifted away, unable to comprehend the necessity and intensity of her work. Evelyn remained undeterred, understanding that her purpose transcended conventional human relationships. She existed for the dead, as much as for the living who had yet to be saved or properly acknowledged. In her final documented exhumations, Evelyn discovered anomalies that further reinforced the depth of the systemic failures she had unearthed. Coffins were misaligned, bodies partially exposed, soil unevenly disturbed, and whispers urgent with unresolved stories. Each encounter deepened her understanding of the fragility of life, the consequences of negligence, and the persistence of consciousness beyond death. Evelyn meticulously recorded every detail, knowing that these documents would outlast her, providing evidence, warnings, and guidance to those who might follow in her footsteps. Though exhausted, she continued her nightly vigils, kneeling beside graves, whispering apologies, listening intently, and documenting each anomaly. She had become inseparable from her work, her identity fused with the mission she had undertaken, the task of bearing witness to the dead's unrest, and the moral imperative to ensure acknowledgement for every prematurely silenced voice. As she walked the snow-covered cemetery paths, lantern in hand, Evelyn felt a haunting sense of purpose, understanding that perfection was unattainable but that vigilance itself was justice. Her work had transformed St. Helena's Hospital, Holy Cross Cemetery, and the perceptions of those few who were aware of her tireless dedication. Graves were observed, records corrected, and families received closure, yet the whispering, restless presence of the dead remained, a perpetual reminder of what had been lost and what could never fully be regained. Evelyn's legacy endured, a dark testament to unwavering dedication, moral courage, and the haunting reality of the consequences of neglect. She had become the voice of the voiceless, the witness to horrors that were both human and supernatural, and the guardian of truths that could not be ignored. The night stretched on, silent but alive with whispers, as Evelyn Carr continued her vigil, a solitary figure in a world unaware of the depth of her sacrifice and the enduring presence of those who had once been silenced prematurely.